Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stevens with a lecture on form in lyric poetry. And as I get started, let me point out that I will be recording this lecture in two different sessions, form in Poetry 1 and form in Poetry 2, dividing the lecture up into two different recordings, or as we call them, integrity classes, just so that I'm not asking you to sit through a lecture or a recording that's more than about 30 minutes or so. All right, let's get started. What do we mean by form? Form is the shape that content takes, where by content we mean things like the subject or the theme or perhaps simply meaning itself. Now, these things are all abstract. Suppose I want to write a poem about love. Love is an abstraction. It's an idea in the head. It has in itself, that idea, no particular form, but form is that which makes the abstract concrete. That is, it gives it some kind of shape. It takes the form of something that can be seen, something that can be heard, and so on, okay? So by the concrete, that's what we mean. We mean things we can see and hear and touch, smell, taste, and so on, all right? So that's concrete. Now, the word love in itself is concrete because you can hear me say love. You can see the letters L-O-V-E on the page. So already, just the word itself is bringing it into the concrete. All right, so that's what form is. Okay, we take an idea, we take a subject, we take a theme, we take some kind of meaning we want to get across, and we put it into some kind of form. What are the elements of form? The important ones for lyric poetry I've listed right here, okay? And they are words. Okay, first of all, you need to have words in order to have a poem, right? So the word is the very basic form that an idea takes. So we're working with words. Verse, beginning with the idea of line. Rhythm and meter. We talked about rhythm and meter in another lecture on the sound in poetry. Language, especially metaphor and image. And language is also the subject of another lecture, so I'm not going to go into that in detail here. Stanza, rhyme, and finally length. Okay, so we'll be talking about verse. We'll be getting back to rhythm and meter when we talk about verse, and also talking about stanza, rhyme, and length. Let's start with line and verse. So words then take the form of a line. And what is a line? Okay, well, this is a line right here. This particular line goes across the page here, right? Horizontally, it starts with the word words, and it ends with the word verse. So a sequence then, okay? A sequence of words from left to right across the page, okay? So across the page when we're reading, right? Or, I mean, that is reading something that is written, or if you're speaking it, all right, from stop, okay? Actually, this probably should change this to start, right? By stop, I mean where you're not saying anything, to starting to say something, to pause when speaking. So let's look at some lines here. Here is a famous line. This is from Hamlet's famous soliloquy in the play Hamlet, Shakespeare's tragedy. To be or not to be, that is the question. Okay, that is a line of verse. If I'm reading it, begins with those letters T-O, ends with this word question, right? Okay? Or if I'm speaking it, I begin speaking with to and I end speaking with question. Now, you might ask, okay, well, if you're speaking, do you really stop at the end of the line? Not necessarily. Not necessarily, but there is always some kind of pause, even if it's very hard to hear. All right? Whether to be or not to be, that is the question. Now, if we put it together with the next line, all right, which the sequence of words here is whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer. And Hamlet goes on to talk about what we suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and so on. But that's a line. Now, if we put them together, all right, we have two lines of verse. To be or not to be, that is the question. Pause. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and so on. But that's your basic concept. Line. Okay? Poems take the form of lines. All right, so you know what a line is. Sequence of words from left to right or from start to pause. And notice I didn't say start to stop, because you don't actually come to a full stop when you read a line of verse. There is simply that little pause, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Okay, now, what do we mean by verse? Okay, verse is a word that originally means simply to turn. So if I get to the word question, all right, what happens? My eyes then turn, right? I'm over here on the right, okay, with that colon. My eyes turn back to the left to whether. So a verse is essentially a turning from one line to the next line. That's your basic verse. Now, verse also has a more general meaning of, say, all of the verses, all of the lines in a poem. We say that poem is written in verse. We mean that all of those lines are verse. All right. So verse is sometimes used as a synonym for poetry itself. But in this particular case, we are talking about lines of poetry. Now, verse, that is lines, can be divided into two kinds. We have metrical verse, all right, and we have free verse. Metrical verse is written in meter, all right? So we say it is verse that is written in lines of an established metrical pattern. We'll get to that in a second. All right. And free verse is verse that has no established metrical pattern. And I'm going to give you examples of each. So metrical verse takes us back to the sound of poetry and to, in particular, the sound of meter and rhythm. Now, let me remind you what we mean by meter. Meter is a word that simply means measure. And when it comes to verse, and metrical verse in particular, what are we measuring? We're measuring syllables and we're measuring accent. What then is rhythm? Rhythm is the overall sound, the overall pattern of sound of syllables, stresses and unstressed syllables, accents and unaccented syllables. It's the overall sound that is created by that particular meter, that sound of the accented and the unaccented. So Shakespeare's sonnets, all right, are examples of metrical verse. So here are the opening lines, right, of Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. Can you see those then? Okay? Sonnet 73, opening 4 lines. And notice that the lines are marked by these syllables: hold, right? Hang, cold, and sang. All right, you see that? Okay, those mark the ends of those lines. So each of those is a line. We got 4 of them. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bear ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Okay, well, you can see that I have marked the accented syllables with the bold italics underlined. Okay, those are the accented syllables. Again, remember what we mean by accent. An accented syllable is a syllable that gets a little bit more volume, that is, it's louder, and it is a little bit higher in pitch. All right, so these words, time, or these syllables rather, they're not all words, some of them are just syllables in words. These syllables then are the ones that get the accent, right? Time, year, mayest, me, hold, and so on, right? So I read that in a way that would give you a sense of where the accent falls, just to emphasize that. Of course, I wouldn't normally read a poem with that much accent, right? Just as I don't say the word accent with that much accent, right? So it's more likely to go something like, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bear ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Okay, but the idea here is metrical verse has that underlying rhythm that is created by the sound of the accented and the unaccented syllables. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, and so on. And remember, lines, okay, the lines break at the words behold and so on. Okay, and these words establish a line as being 10 syllables long. Okay, so that's your line in a Shakespeare. In this particular sonnet, it's the line in all of Shakespeare's sonnets, and that line then is written in a particular meter. All right, so these lines establish that familiar metrical pattern, the dominant pattern in English poetry, which is iambic. And remember, the iamb is simply the alternation of an unaccented, such as up, up, and an accented on syllable, right? Upon, okay? And so on. So you alternate, the iamb is alternating unaccented followed by accented. Pentameter, the meter then of nearly all of Shakespeare's verse, pentameter simply means 5 of those iambs, or 5 stresses in a line. So you can count them, right? Last line here, bear, rue, and choirs, right? Late and sweet, that's 4 of them. Sang, that's 5 of them. 5 accented syllables out of 10. All right, free verse. Langston Hughes wrote both metrical and free verse. I hope you know who Langston Hughes is. Very important American poet, also important African American poet. And his poem, widely anthologized, Theme for English B, is in free verse. Well, he also wrote metrical verse, but we're looking at an example of free verse. Remember what free verse is. Free verse is verse, that is, it is still written in lines. One horizontal sequence of words from left to right, okay? Still written in lines, but no established metrical pattern. So he writes, and here we go. This is from the middle of his poem Theme for English B. And if you haven't read this poem, look it up and read it. It's a very good, very important poem. And he writes, and try to hear now that there is no really clear underlying rhythm the way there is in us Shakespeare's sonnet, okay? Right? So it goes, well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, or records, Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white, but it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me, as I am a part of you. Now, please keep this in mind when you are thinking about metrical and free verse. All good verse, whether it is free or whether it is metrical, has rhythm. There is a sound to it. And when we talk about rhythm, we simply mean the sound of the beat, the accents, okay? So there is going to be rhythm to this Langston Hughes poem, but it's not going to be a regular metrical rhythm, okay? Keep that distinction in mind so you can hear this rhythm. Look at the rhythm that's established by the repetition in the first 3 lines of that phrase, I like. Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. You hear there's a rhythm to that because there is a repetition of the accented syllables. Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, and so on, okay? So you hear repetition. You hear repetition of phrases such as I like. You hear repetition of sequences of nouns, right? Such as eat, sleep, drink, right? Or work, read, learn. These things, this repetition establishes a rhythm, okay? And in anyone who knows how to speak effectively, you're always going to hear a rhythm, okay? But it's not metrical, meaning it is not a clearly measured sequence or pattern of accented and unaccented syllables. All right? So, again, the lines here are in verse, okay? They break at specific words such as love, life, and so on, but they're not in any established metrical pattern. Free verse. Now, free verse also is unrhymed, and we're going to look at rhyme here, okay? Now, rhyme. It's very common to think of poetry as the stuff that rhymes, as if somehow rhyme defined poetry. Prose is the stuff that doesn't rhyme, poetry is the stuff that does. No. Rhyme is a fairly recent, in the 5,000-year history of written literature, rhyme is a fairly recent invention. But because it has been so dominant for the past, more than 500 years, 800 years or so, because rhyme has dominated lyric poetry so much, we tend to associate it with poetry. But there are important unrhymed verse forms. Free verse, for the most part, has no rhyme, okay? Blank verse, I'm going to give you an example here. Blank verse is verse that is metrical. It has an established metrical pattern, all right? But it's blank in the sense that it has no rhyme. So here is a poem in blank verse, Birches by Robert Frost. Okay, it's a long poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we will get back to it later on when we talk about length and when we talk about form, stanza form, okay? But it goes like this. When I see birches bend to left and right across the line of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay. As ice storms do, I'm sorry, okay? Now, do you hear the repetition there of the accents? Again, iambic pentameter, all right? Let me write that out here. Okay, and we'll put that in bold. iambicpentameter. This is iambic pentameter, but unlike the Shakespeare poem, we didn't point out that it rhymed, but I'm sure that you could hear that sonnet 73 was written in rhyming verse. Okay, blank verse doesn't rhyme, but it is still written in that iambic pentameter, that metrical pattern. So it is metrical verse, unrhymed metrical verse, blank verse. When I, okay, you can pick out the accented syllables here or words. When I see burr, okay, first syllable of birches is emphasized. Birches bend to left and right. When I, 1, see birches 2, bend 3, to left 4, and right 5, 5 accented syllables, iambic pentameter. All right, let's move on here. Okay, it's a long poem, folks. We'll get back to this, why it's so long. And then we have rhymed verse. Okay, so there is metrical verse that is unrhymed, such as blank verse, and then there is metrical verse that is rhymed. And again, free verse, where does that fall? Most free verse is unrhymed. The sonnet, as a form of rhymed verse, is probably the most familiar. Okay, clearly established form. Sometimes sonnets that have an established form are called poems in closed form. Closed meaning it's not open to any kind of variation. I mean, this is the way it is. Okay, it's established. So what is the form of the sonnet? Well, we say that it's 14 lines. Remember, line is one of the elements of form. Okay, and it is rhymed. Remember, we said that rhyme was another element of form, and then it is in iambic pentameter. That's your meter, and we said that meter is another element of form. So here is the form of the sonnet. 14 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. Going back to sonnet 73. Going to read the whole thing to you folks, okay? Partly because I just love the sound of this poem. All right, so here we go. And we're going to get back to this too when we talk about stanza. All right, sonnet 73. Now notice, by the way, that I haven't said much about meaning yet, have I? Remember, or content, or theme, or subject. Remember that I began by saying that form is what the subject or the theme or the content. Form is what makes, is basically the shape that content takes. We haven't really talked about content yet. All right? So please don't think that I'm deliberately leaving you in the dark and ignoring something important about what all of these poems mean, whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's Frost or whether it's Langston Hughes. No, of course, there is meaning there. There are subjects these poems deal with and so on. So I can point out that Sonnet 73 deals implicitly, implied in the metaphors, okay, deals with the phenomenon of growing old, all right? So Shakespeare wants to write a poem about growing old. That's his subject. What form does that subject take? We're talking about form in poetry here, right? What subject, what form does it take? It takes the form of a sonnet. Lines, rhyme, meter, okay? That time of year thou mayest in me behold when, by the way, notice the pause. Even though the sentence does not end there, there is still a little pause. That time of year thou mayest in me behold when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceiv'st, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. Okay. And by the way, we finally find at the end of the poem that it's not just about the phenomenon of growing old, that is getting into the autumn of one's life, right? Or to the sunset of one's life, or to the going out of the fire of one's life. It's also about love, okay? Now, I don't need to point out the metrical pattern. You already know that, all right? So we've talked about that, and let's count the lines. You know what a line is by now, no problem with that, so it's easy to count them. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. 14 lines, iambic pentameter, and then we have rhyme. Now notice what I've done over here on the right. We've got A, and we've got B, and we've got A, and we've got B again. All we are doing, and this is the convention for noting the rhyme pattern in a rhymed poem, the convention is simply to assign a letter to each rhymed sound. So we begin with the letter A for the first sound in the poem, and then on to B for the second sound, and so on. So the first sound is old, okay? All right, so we say that's A, and the second sound is ang, so we call that B. And low and B, hold. We repeat A with old in cold, and we repeat ang with the ang in sang. So we have a pattern of alternating rhymes, old, ang, A, B, A, B. In this second group of 4 lines, and notice that it's in groups of 4, we go to a new sound, A. All right, we have not heard that sound before, so that's a new one. All right, well, we're down to letter C, so we call that C and O. And look at this. In the 6th line of the poem, the second line of this particular group of 4, we have est. All right, so that's going to be our D sound. So we have a est, day, west, away, rest, alternating rhyme sounds. And then on to a third pattern, right? Here at the end, not the end of the poem, but here in the third group of 4 lines, we have EF, EF, fire, lie, expire, buy, right? And then finally, at the very end of the poem, we have the G rhyme, okay? So this would be A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So we have a total of 7 rhyming sounds, right? And here the G sound is ong, as in strong and in long. So, an example of a closed poetic form, the sonnet, an example of rhymed metrical verse, all right? So, that, folks, is the end of part 1. And in part 2, we will continue with the subject of stanza. Thanks for listening, and please be sure to listen to Form in Poetry 2.